Welcome to Stay Home, Stay Focused. I'm Jack Moline. I'm the president of Interfaith Alliance. And my guest today, I'm very pleased to say, is my colleague, Katy Joseph, who is our ULMA and John Baugh Director of Policy and Advocacy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that title in a minute. But first, Katy, the same question I ask everybody. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, Jack. Thanks so much for having me today.
It's my pleasure. I know you're holed up in rural Virginia, having escaped the city because of the restrictions there. How are you keeping yourself occupied other than worrying about keeping yourself and your loved ones safe?
That's a great question. I think everyone, wherever they're sheltering in place right now, is getting a little bit stir crazy. So I would probably put myself and my family in that category as well. But you know, we're coming off a week of holidays. As you know, Jack, I'm Jewish and my husband is Christian, and so in 1 week we both participated in a virtual family Seder, which was wild and a lot of fun. And then for Easter, did a virtual visit from the Easter Bunny through the window for my 1-year-old nephew.
Very nice.
We're finding ways to find a little bit of joy in this whole thing.
Very nice. And of course, neither you nor I has to observe Ramadan, but we want to wish everybody who will be observing that starting next week a meaningful fast and a meaningful iftar each night.
Absolutely.
Katy, this is the first of these webcasts that we've been doing that's been focused entirely on Interfaith Alliance and our work. And I imagine that there are some people who are watching us or listening to us who don't know much about Interfaith Alliance. How would you present who we are and what we do to someone who's first encountering us here?
So Interfaith Alliance is a national policy and advocacy organization. We're headquartered in DC and then have state and local affiliates across the country that work to advance religious freedom in its truest sense. This idea that the First Amendment protects the right of every American to believe as we choose, to be free from religious discrimination, and to combat misuses of religion, to perpetrate discrimination. I'm always aware, and when I talk about the work that we do, of how the term religious freedom in particular has been distorted by some who would seek to use their beliefs to exclude others, to discriminate in the name of religion. That's a real departure from what religious freedom has meant in this country for a very long time. And it's an ongoing struggle to make sure that everyone has that freedom of belief, including the freedom not to follow a faith tradition if
Right.
they choose. And that's their personal decision, not their boss's decision, not their wedding cake baker's decision, or the government's decision for that matter.
Well, you tipped the hand on our agenda a little bit there, but that's fine. I'm going to ask you to do what's impossible right now and ignore the coronavirus. What's your agenda these days?
Well, it's a little bit hard to ignore the moment that we're in.
Right.
And one of our top priorities in the federal policy work that we do is really protecting zealously the separation of religion and government. And in this moment of crisis, I truly believe that separation is more essential than ever before. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that reflected in the response efforts that are coming from some of the administrative agencies that are seeking to respond to the current moment. So we have been working very hard to engage with the Small Business Administration, for instance, that is overseeing the distribution of funds under the CARES Act, this paycheck protection program that was really designed to ensure that workers are paid through this crisis, but included a loophole that for the first time ever would allow federal funds to flow directly to support explicitly religious activities. And there's no question that religious community faith is playing a very prominent role in the lives of many of us who are kind of struggling in this moment. But that doesn't mean that this is the time to tear down that wall of separation between religion and government. So that's really been top of mind these days.
Are you finding a responsiveness from government, or any more or less of a responsiveness than we usually do in your efforts to communicate?
Um, I think it's challenging for many of the decision makers and the negotiators around these assistance bills to identify kind of what are the key priorities right now. And so we're doing everything we can in partnership with many of our both faith-based allies, our partners who work on church-state separation issues, as well as civil rights groups, to make sure that this question around the protection of the separation of church and state stays at the forefront.
Good. I also know you're watching a number of Supreme Court cases. We're expecting some decisions to be announced, and there are some cases being heard in unusual circumstances. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So as folks might be aware, the Supreme Court, as kind of with everybody in terms of how we're going about our regular business, is having to get creative in how they're releasing decisions, hearing oral arguments, kind of the general operations of the court. So there are 3 top priority cases that we have been actively involved in, have joined amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs, and we're expecting decisions on in the next few weeks. The first, which has gotten a lot of attention, is around discrimination against LGBTQ employees. The real crux of the question there is whether prohibitions on discrimination on the basis of sex include sex stereotyping. The idea that someone's sex should inform who they're romantically involved with, how they present themselves, which is often used as a tool against LGBTQ employees. These sort of ideas about gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation are often embodied in religious tradition. And we've seen instances where bosses, employers have said, my faith teaches me this about sexual orientation, and you don't match up with that expectation, so I can't continue to hire you or have you employed here. That's really problematic, and that's kind of where we came in on that case. And so we're hoping for a decision that protects the rights of all employees to be free from discrimination, either in the name of religion or generally. So that's case 1. Case 2 involves restrictions, requirements that have been placed on healthcare providers, abortion doctors in Louisiana, requiring admitting privileges for those who provide care in abortion clinics at a nearby hospital. We know that these restrictions are not medically justified, even though that's often how they're described. And in fact, they've been struck down in Texas and other places as a burden on the right to privacy and to access abortion services for patients who feel that's what they need. Often these restrictions, again, are justified in the name of faith. This idea that a legislator has a particular belief around reproductive health, around abortion in particular, and therefore tries to legislate that belief into practice, impacting patients and providers statewide. So we're watching for a decision there too. And finally, the third case that we're watching is around public money for public schools. This is out of Montana and involves something of a complicated tax program credit that would essentially channel taxpayer dollars to private religious schools. And there's a real concern there again about using taxpayer monies to advance explicitly religious activities.
There's a lot going on, even though nobody's really meeting in person.
Yes.
We also were focused on a number of pieces of legislation that are in various stages of moving through the two houses of Congress, but have been interrupted by this necessary pause in the national normal. Can you talk about a couple of those legislative initiatives and how we at home ought to be paying attention to them at this moment?
Sure. So we had an incredibly exciting moment before everything kind of went into lockdown around the No Ban Act. And this is a bill that has been long overdue, and specifically would overturn the ban on predominantly Muslim countries that has been adopted by this administration now a number of times over, and been expanded to a number of African countries as well. Of course, the issue there is that even if these bans have gotten creative in how they describe what they're trying to do, they are targeting immigrants, family and friends of Americans, folks who are have job offers or schooling opportunities in the United States and are being excluded because of their faith. And that is religious discrimination. And the No Ban Act would overturn the Muslim ban and also prevent a similar type of ban on this type of basis in the future.
So the status of that is it's been passed by the House of Representatives.
Yes.
And has been referred to the Senate, which is in effective recess right now.
Yes, that is true.
We're also looking at another piece of legislation that passed the House earlier in this session and is also sort of caught in this limbo period of time, the Equality Act. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. This was another incredibly exciting moment. This was, the Equality Act has been introduced in Congress session after session going back decades. And this was the first time that we saw a groundswell of support to the extent that it finally came to the floor and was passed in the House. And the Equality Act would set consistent, uniform protections for LGBTQ people in key areas of everyday life. It would also strengthen and modernize existing civil rights laws that say were written in the 60s and don't include many of the ways that we engage in everyday life now in 2020. This is an urgently needed bill for at least in part the issues that are coming up around employment discrimination, but would have a tremendous impact on the well-being of LGBTQ people and their families and loved ones across the country if and when it passes.
And why is this an important issue for us who we describe ourselves as defenders of religious freedom? How does sexual identity and self-identification, discrimination against that, fit into our professed commitment to the First Amendment's guarantees of religious freedom and conscience?
It's a fantastic question, Jack. And I think there are two pieces to this. First and foremost, there is a not insignificant myth of people of faith on one side and the LGBTQ community on the other.
Right.
Like I said, that's a myth. There are many LGBTQ people who are people of faith. There are many people of faith who celebrate and affirm LGBTQ people and see no conflict whatsoever in recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of all people, of all sexual orientations and gender identities. And so we have been at the forefront of this work to ensure that that perspective and those folks who often find themselves pulled in two directions know that they have a strong and robust and enthusiastic interfaith coalition backing them up and fighting for their rights. So that's part one. The second part is that often discrimination against LGBTQ people is again justified in the name of religion. This idea that because my faith teaches a particular view on sexual orientation and gender identity, I should be able to impose that on others, either seeing it reflected in law or imposed on my employees or the folks who I serve in my store. And that is a distortion of what religious freedom means. We are protected in our personal beliefs, and religious communities are protected to teach their doctrine without government interference. But we don't have the right to impose those beliefs on others or expect the government to back us up when we do so.
And I'd also add to that, and I think you will probably agree with me, that the issue surrounding what constitutes a person's sense of self-identification, either in terms of their sexuality or their gender identification, is something that was presumed to be a matter of science for many years. And we've now discovered that that scientific evidence isn't quite so clear. What is left when we try to define in a binary situation is a commitment that is really grounded in religious belief and faith belief that drove a lot of research into science. And in the scientific method, you accept what the conclusion is, even if it doesn't meet your hypothesis. In a faith-based circumstance, to which each of us is entitled as a matter of conscience, you're allowed to frame the world as you wish to see it, but the Constitution guarantees that we can't impose it on others if evidence presents to the contrary.
Yes.
So we have that too.
Yes.
And the third area that I want to ask you about is the upcoming elections. Interfaith Alliance has always had a robust program of keeping people informed about what they can expect and not expect candidates to discuss when they're running for office or when they're holding office. We have guides that instruct houses of worship. We have guides that offer advice and guidance to candidates. And we have a series of questions that we encourage citizens to consider as they evaluate the candidates in front of them, not about their faith, but about their use of faith in the campaign. But we're just about to enter a most extraordinary campaign season in which all of those rules are going to fly out the window. No member of a campaign is going to be appearing before a packed house of worshipers anytime soon. What should we be thinking about in terms of the upcoming elections and religious freedom?
Well, Jack, you and I have had many conversations hypothesizing about what the next few months are going to look like on the front, and I don't think we've come to any sort of conclusion.
Well, that's why I'm asking the questions.
Well, I mean, here's what I would say. I think that the moment that we find ourselves in has really proven that voting is more essential than ever. This is the mechanism by which we as citizens can protect our institutions, can advance our values, and ensure that we move forward with an eye toward justice. I think the questions that we encourage our supporters and people who are concerned about religious freedom to pose to candidates still hold true. It's important for voters of all faiths and of no faith to where they can push candidates on how they would handle matters of faith and freedom. How would they stand up for the rights of people who believe differently than they do, who rely on their elected representative to fight just as hard for them as they would for their own family, and to take seriously the real profound diversity of religious faith, communities, expression in the United States. There's an idea, and I think in some ways it's a misguided one, of what the faith voter looks like. And I think it's fair to say that that person probably doesn't sound like or have the beliefs that you or I have, Jack. And that's neither here nor there. But people of faith of many different perspectives, including liberal and progressive perspectives, vote based on their faith values. And those may include caring for the earth on the belief that this is a gift from God that we're asked to shepherd and care for. It means voting for economic justice because we're called to care for the least among us and ensure that everyone has opportunities rooted in fairness, not exploitation. I mean, these are the kinds of questions that, however we're voting, and whatever this election season ends up looking like, that it's really crucial for folks who can vote to be able to do so safely, to the maximum extent possible, and do so from a place of personal values and moral ideals.
It's a great answer, and obviously something we'll talk more about when we try to get down to brass tacks and how we'll try to help our supporters and the nation navigate this unusual season. I'm going to ask you one more theoretical question, and then I'll say a couple of words before we close out. With everything that's going on, Katy, why should the people who are watching and listening to this spend time worrying about religious freedom? Why should the nation spend time worrying about religious freedom when our immediate concern is the health and safety of the population?
I think the second half of your question answered the first half of your question, and I'll explain why. I think that our response to this current crisis must be rooted in science, must be intentional, and must protect all of us. And unfortunately, we have seen in this crisis and in past crises, there's been a lot of talk kind of thinking back to the mistakes that were made after September 11th. A lot of the scapegoating and harassment and extreme surveillance of American Muslim communities for something that was thrust upon them. And I am profoundly concerned that we may find ourselves in a similar situation where, out of fear, minority groups, we're already seeing this with Asian American communities, are forced to bear the burden of what we are grappling with as a nation. So when we stand up for religious freedom, we stand up for the rights of minorities who are receiving undue surveillance, condemnation, discrimination in this moment of urgency, and ensuring that we protect the rights of all of us to believe as we choose.
Well, that's absolutely right. The Eula May and John Baugh Foundation has been instrumental in helping to fund Interfaith Alliance, and particularly our policy advocacy and education programs. And that's why this past week we were able to announce, Katy, that you have been promoted to the position of Director of Policy and Advocacy for Interfaith Alliance. I'm very glad to be able to acknowledge that to your face and to the world right now, even though we've talked about it privately for a while. So I think those of you who are watching and listening to this understand why that's such a blessing for us and why we're looking forward to many more good things in our work with Katy. So the last question I always ask everybody is, what briefly can you offer to people to be inspired and engaged during these times when they're otherwise occupied with coronavirus concerns?
Well, I don't know if inspiration is necessarily the way that I would describe it, but I have been trying in terms of how I approach each day and how I approach my relationships with loved ones and friends who are struggling right now is to be kind to ourselves and to one another. I think that there's a real sense of grief right now. For some, it may be for health or for loved ones who are ill or have passed away. For others, it's for the loss of regular routine and freedom of movement, for lost income and social supports. And we need to recognize that and be okay with how we're feeling in any given moment, and be kind to others who may find themselves in the same place.
Wonderful. Katy Joseph, Director of Policy and Advocacy for Interfaith Alliance, thanks for being with us today. And to everyone who's watching and listening, stay home, stay focused.